Former President Donald Trump has been taking hits on the legal front all week, and he could be indicted in the next. And yet again, there are concerns that the former president's incendiary rhetoric could be putting lives in danger. Alvin Bragg is investigating former President Trump regarding a hush money payment to Stormy Daniels during the 2016 presidential campaign. Yesterday, Bragg was the target of a death threat. Bragg received a letter that said, "Alvin, I'm going to kill you." In the envelope, a suspicious white powder, which was determined not to be dangerous. Not to mention, there have been reportedly dozens of threats of harm against Bragg and hundreds of threats to the district attorney's office. This all comes as the former president has been ratcheting up his rhetoric on social media, writing, quote, potential death and destruction if he is charged with a crime. Then adding that any prosecutor making that decision would be a, quote, deranged psychopath. In another now deleted post, Trump showing himself, images of himself with a baseball bat near Bragg's head, Trump has also called Alvin Bragg an animal. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries is sending a warning that Trump's attacks on social media are reckless. Take a listen.
Well, the twice impeached former president's rhetoric is reckless, reprehensible, and irresponsible. It's dangerous, and if he keeps it up, he's going to get someone killed.
Everyone should be unsettled by the targeting of Alvin Bragg. I agree with Leader Jeffries. Not to mention that the former president is literally calling for death and destruction. All of this as Donald Trump finally decided to get back on the campaign trail, holding the very first rally of his 2024 presidential campaign in Waco, Texas, in just a few hours. We're going to dig into the significance of that place and that setting and some of Donald Trump's other mounting legal pressures in just a few moments. But first, earlier today, I spoke with Lanny Davis, the attorney for Michael Cohen. Cohen is a central witness, to say the least, in Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg's investigation of Trump's hush money payment. Here's our conversation. DA Bragg has received at least one death threat that we know of. On Thursday, the former president referred to him as an animal. I don't have to tell you about what that means. Alvin Bragg is the first. He's a black district attorney. He's a black district attorney of Manhattan. The president is also threatening violence if he is, in fact, indicted. Are you concerned?
Of course. And I quote my client, Michael Cohen, when he began his testimony. One of the first things he said to me when we discussed my representing him is that Donald Trump is a liar, that Michael Cohen did his dirty deeds and lied for him for 10 years. And he predicted in front of Elijah Cummings that Mr. Trump, if and when he's defeated for re-election, would not accept the election results, and that he's a dangerous man. So what he's now doing with Mr. Bragg is just consistent with what we've seen before from Mr. Trump.
I think a lot of people should be vigilant about this rhetoric from the former president. Let's talk about this upcoming week. So on Monday, the grand jury will meet again in the Trump hush money case. Has Michael Cohen been asked to testify, or has he been asked to be on standby for that?
So I can answer now, certainly publicly on your show. The answer is I've not heard a word. He can't testify without me. I'm in Washington. I have to get on a train and get to New York. So this is Saturday afternoon, and the answer is not yet.
Not yet. Well, we have a day. Well, what do you know about the timeline going forward, if anything?
I don't know a thing. I do know that Michael has spent at least 5 sessions with very meticulous and very professional prosecutors working for Mr. Bragg. And Michael and I have only the greatest respect for the detailed documentation. In many ways do I define the word documentation, that if this case goes forward, and that's still an if, this case is about documents and indisputable facts. And anyone who thinks this is a weak case doesn't know what I know.
So, Mr. Davis, I think that it is a fact that Michael Cohen has done a lot of television. We've invited him here onto this program, and we hope to see him very soon. And for a lot of folks, his appearances have generated concerns that he could jeopardize the case. First, do you agree with that assertion? And then secondly, how are you navigating that?
So I don't agree even slightly This case is about facts. And I start by saying, don't worry about Michael Cohen's testimony, although it's truthful. And he's proven that since July 2nd, 2018, when he broke with Mr. Trump and what he said were 10 years of doing his lies and dirty deeds. That's the way he lived for 10 years. On July 2nd, 2018, he came out publicly and spoke truth to power. And since then, he's been truthful. But let me also remind you that Donald Trump's prosecutors in the Southern District of New York on December 7th, 2018, published a memo to the court in which they said that Michael Cohen admitted, meaning they had the evidence and he agreed, that Donald Trump, President of the United States then, so they couldn't indict him, but before he was president, instructed Michael Cohen to pay the hush money.
Yes, in that memo, they referred to him as the former president, then president, as individual one in the memo. So I have asked legal experts, journalists who have been covering this case for a while, particularly about that memo. And I've also asked about the juxtaposition between, I know you remember the case against Senator Edwards, where he paid, he had supporters pay, asked supporters to pay $1 million to someone to keep an affair quiet. Senator Edwards was indicted, but a jury, it was a hung jury, and the Department of Justice eventually declined to, they just dropped the case. So I have thought that there were very strong similarities, and I think the point you're making about the memo is a good one, but this is, the Department of Justice decided not to pursue former President Trump under that particular case. Do you have concerns, or do you agree with folks who, I know that you've said that this isn't a weak case, but there are people that say the Department of Justice wouldn't even take this up, and now, after all this time, Alvin Bragg is taking it up. What say you?
So, Symone, first of all, on the strength or weakness of the case, and comparing it to the Edwards case. That's what juries are for. Is there a case that can go to a jury as to whether or not there was any 1% political motivation when Donald Trump instructed Michael Cohen, out of his own equity line of credit, to pay $130,000? Did Trump have any political motivation? Because the prosecutors say that Trump directed, and that was the admission they got Michael Cohen to admit to from the evidence, directed Cohen to make the payment. So your question is, was there any political motivation by Mr. Trump to try to prevent the Stormy Daniels alleged affair? He denies it. Did have any political motivation? That's a jury question. The Edwards jury found in a tie or a hung jury vote, we don't know how or why, that they were unable to reach a unanimous decision on that. And Mr. Edwards did have a dying wife of cancer, so we don't know what happened in the jury room. My point to your viewers, Symone, that's a jury question. The due process system gives Mr. Trump the presumption of guilt. There is a trial. He gets a chance to put his evidence on, and then it goes to the jury whether he had any political motivation waiting to right before the election and not wanting Stormy Daniels to go public. And that we'll wait to see what a jury says. So we can't know the answer, but we all believe in the jury system.
So, Michael Cohen's former legal advisor, Robert Costello, and he testified to the grand jury at the request of Donald Trump's team this past week. He has said that your client is on a revenge tour. Is Mr. Cohen seeking revenge here? And given what you just said, I'm interested, what if the Manhattan DA decides not to indict Mr. Trump? Then what? But first to the question of, is Michael Cohen on a revenge tour? We will
respect what the case is about, what the facts are about. But let's just talk about Mr. Costello. I can't comment to you on what happened in that grand jury room when he testified. I can only say that we came and waited for 2 hours in case Michael Cohen was needed to contradict Mr. Costello. And we were told he was not needed. Secondly, in today's Daily Beast, Mr. Costello's emails speak for themselves. One email says, in an email to his partner, we need to keep up the appearance that we're trying to help Mr. Cohen when Mr. Giuliani and the president don't want us to let on. And what we really know is to keep him in the tent. So Mr. Costello is simply doing what Trump always does. It's just to deflect from the merits of the case. Did Trump commit a crime by instructing Michael Cohen to pay the hush money? And then he wrote checks as a sitting president for $35,000 a month for 11 months, did he commit a crime? That's up to a jury to decide, and for Mr. Bragg to decide to bring an indictment, and that's up to them.
We will be waiting with bated breath to see if anything comes out of the grand jury on Monday. Lanny Davis, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.